What is up, guys? I'm Doug Polk, and welcome back to Poker Hands for another World Series of Poker Main Event 2016 hand. Today we're going to be looking at a hand between Dan Colman and Fernando Pons, a person who made the November 9. So on that note, let's go ahead and jump into the action.
Pons with Queen 10 of spades saw Dan Colman open for $360,000 with the hand of the hour, pocket nines.
Fernando is making a habit out of winning from behind, which is a graduate course at the Norman Chad School of Poker.
He's in the cutoff seat, one off the button. 16 million chips to work with and a raise to 1 million with suited seductive cards.
One day you're working for a home improvement outlet and win a salad for a few euros into the main event. The next day you're three-betting the great Dan Colman with 4 tables left at the main event. Nothing like poker.
Colman will call for $640,000 more.
Our hand begins with Dan Colman opening it up from the low jack, that is the position next to the high jack, with pocket nines to a little bit over 2 big blinds, certainly the standard play. Now action falls to Fernando Pons, who has Queen 10 suited in the cutoff. Now, I would say when you're in the cutoff and you have a hand as strong as Queen 10 suited, you really have some options. You could decide to flat and play a flop, and I might look at the line of people behind me to try and decide, are they squeeze happy? Are they 3-betting a lot? Do I think I can get to see the flop a lot? And if so, I might elect to flat. However, if people have been aggressive or you think Dan Colman is opening too wide, you can turn this hand into a bluff and 3-bet. Now, what kind of sucks about bluffing with this hand is if you get jammed on, you lose all your value in the hand, whereas if you flat, you're much more likely to see a flop. That said, you might win the pot directly pre-flop by re-raising, so there's definitely merit to both plays, and you might want to consider what people at your table combined with what your play style is. Anyway, the blind's full and it gets back to Colman, and when you have a hand like a middle pocket pair and you face a 3-bet, you're generally going to see the flop. You have you're favored against some of the bluffs, and you have a lot of equity against hands that are value bets like ace, king, ace, queen. And then versus the high pairs, yeah, you're pretty far behind, but you could always try and flop a set. So definitely standard pre-flop from both players, and let's see what the flop is.
Here's the flop. 8-8 jack. Colman with 2 pair now is still best, and he checks to Pons with a useless gut shot as a 9 gives Dan a boat.
Pons is a big fan of fellow Spaniard Adrian Mateos, phenomenal young pro who already has 2 bracelets.
Pons with chips, $1,000,001.
The amateur continues to attack the pro. If Colman senses he's weak, he could check raise here.
Colman putting chips together. He has none of those mini red frisbees worth $500,000 each. He'll use the lavenders to make the call.
The flop comes Jack 8-8 Rainbow, which all things considered for Dan Colman is a pretty good flop. Yeah, there's an overcard, but a jack is a lot less likely than a hand like an ace, a card like an ace or a card like a king. So, of overcards, this is a reasonable one to be on the board. Additionally, on Jack 8-8, there are a lot of turns that will give him straight draws, like a 10 gives him an open-ender, or a 7 or a queen gives him a gut shot. So not a bad flop, all things considered. Yeah, there's an overcard. You're never pumped when there's an overcard. But as we know from pocket nines before in a hand we talked about, nines can get a little bit dicey in 3-bet pots. That said, when you're facing a cutoff re-raise, you can have hands like ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, and then maybe some suited connected hands like 10-9 suited, queen-10 suited, king-10 suited, all reasonable hands for his opponent to try to bluff him with. Anyway, when you call it 3-bet, you definitely want to kick it off by checking to your opponent, and Dan Colman does. With the action over to Pons, he now decides to bet 1.1 million, which is a reasonable bet size. It's slightly under half pot, and he's setting up to be able to jam the turn. I wouldn't mind maybe even making this a little bit smaller. It's a static board, it's a paired board, and there's no flush draw, so really you're not worried about Dan Colman trying to draw. And if Dan Colman has a jack, you're going to get paid. If you have a good hand. If you have Queen 10, you're probably not going to get paid. Anyway, I don't mind the size, and let's think about what kinds of hands we might want to bet here with. Queen 10 makes sense, 10-9 suited makes sense, and you might want to bet hands like ace-queen or ace-king on the flop to deny your opponent's equity. When Colman has a hand like 7s and he faces a bet, he might be forced to fold facing bets from hands like ace-jack, ace-queen, ace-king, that otherwise if it goes check-check, he might have showdown value. That said, there is some merit to checking ace-king as well. Ace-king could be far ahead of hands like ace-queen or, sorry, I said ace-jack, I meant to say ace-10 earlier, but ace-king could be far ahead of hands like ace-queen or ace-10 and then has a lot of showdown value still. So I don't really mind either play with those overcard type hands. But when you do have these straight draw hands, these queen 10s, these 10-9s, you need to try and bet them, put your opponent in a tough spot, and see if you can get there on the turn. Anyway, so he bets 1.1 million. Colman decides to call, and let's see the turn.
Turn card, king of spades. Colman's still good, but pawns now with a flush draw and a live Broadway draw. Colman checks.
Pawn's still without a hand, but it keeps looking better and better.
And he bets enough to put Colman all in here on the turn.
The turn is the 10 of spades, which is about as close to getting there as pawns can really get without actually getting there. He's improved to 39% equity against Colman because he wins on a 10, queen, ace, or spade. Not 9 because it'll fill up Colman's 9s. In this situation, when Colman checks, this is a slam dunk jam. If he has a hand like ace, king, or king, queen, he can now jam for value. If he has a hand like queens, he can still jam for value, knowing Colman will rarely have a king. And then he wants to mix in some bluffs with a hand like ace 10, queen 10, 10-9, those types of holdings. In this situation, you should also put yourself in Colman's spot, right, if you're pawns. Colman's going to have to call off his tournament life here against a player that could quite easily have top pair. And then even if he doesn't have top pair, let's say he has a hand like queen 10 of spades, Colman's not exactly thrilled because if he's up against a hand like that, he's still going to lose 2 out of 5 times. So this bet makes sense, and I think it's a good example of working in some bluffs into your value range so that your opponent's going to have a difficult time playing against you. And it also really shows that in tournaments, you can apply pressure with these draws successfully. You know, I think that there's, for some reason, a lot of players that feel like they shouldn't be bluffing or like you want to play good hands or whatever they think. But you want to have a balanced approach that includes good hands and bad hands. And part of the reason why you 3-bet a hand like queen 10 suited pre-flop is to be able to balance those ranges. You know, if you don't have 10-9 suited, queen 10 suited, ace 10 suited, how are you going to bluff in these spots? So I like this. I like basically the entire hand from pawns. I think he played the hand well. And now it's back over to Colman.
I have a hand I don't think I can fold.
The new Dan Colman talking it up. Almost a pot-sized bet from pawns.
Colman trying to figure out the amateur.
Where are you from?
Wow. Someone called Danny Negreanu's room. I think his body has been snatched.
Dan is the heads-up specialist, as you mentioned, but a notorious online trash talker. He knows the verbal game.
It looks like Dan Colman lied. He did have a hand he could fold.
Show the bluff.
The amateur stands up to the worldly pro.
Show one card that's a bluff.
You got an 8?
What?
You got an 8? No, okay. The way you were talking, I thought you had an 8. Yeah. I was like, what the hell?
I had a pair of 9s.
After thinking the hand over, Colman decides to fold, and you can hardly blame him. If I have 9s there, I'm going to be very annoyed, but you also just have to lay it down. If your opponent has a hand like ace, king, or king, queen, you're dead to 2 outs. The 5% equity in your tournament life never feels too good. And then, you know, if he was bluffing the flop and has decided to jam the turn with a straight draw or flush draw, he's going to have a bunch of equity against you. Yeah, queen 10 suited, you do block one of the gut shots, but he still has 40%, which kind of shows why this is such a tough situation for Colman. Also interesting to note about Colman's decision here, he has 9-9, which means pawns is less likely to be bluffing, because if he had a hand like 10-9 suited or queen 9 suited or maybe even a really aggressive 9-7 suited, any of those holdings, he's now way less likely to have them because Colman's hand contains 2 9s. I would way rather have a hand like queen jack here, because then if I call it off, and by the way, I would call it off, but if I call it off, then my opponent's less likely to have a hand like ace jack because I blocked that. I don't block 10-9, don't block 9-7. And then on top of it, my opponent's less likely to have a hand like queen queen or king queen. 9s just is a really tough spot and you have to let it go. And I guess the tough thing in poker is sometimes you have to let these hands go knowing that sometimes your opponent's making a move on you, and that's part of the game. Sometimes you just got to chalk it up, wait for a better hand, and make sure you don't just put him on a bluff and call it off. Because, yeah, if you do call here, if you're Colman and you're right, yeah, it's cool, you know, and most of the time you double up. But at the same time, if you're wrong, you're going home and you have way better hands in your range to consider calling with, like any of your jacks. All right, thank you for joining me here for Poker Hands. I'll see you guys soon. If you want to become a better poker player and learn more about poker so that you can start making more money, head over to upswingpoker.com and check it out. I don't really understand this river play, betting 4.7 million here. I think that this needs to be all in. If you look at the stacks, he has about 13 million behind. The pot is currently about 20 million. I don't see a reason to bet just a chunk of his stack, leaving some behind. Look,